You know that feeling when someone underestimates you so badly, they basically hand you the tools to destroy them? Well, buckle up, because this is the story of how my condescending coworker learned that lesson the hard way. By the time I was done with him, his career was in shambles. His reputation was destroyed, and he was begging me for mercy. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, because this revenge was 3 years in the making, and every single move was calculated to perfection. My name is Sarah, and I work in corporate finance for a Fortune 500 company. I'm good at my job, really good. I have 2 master's degrees, speak 4 languages, and I've been consistently promoted every 18 months since I started. But none of that mattered to Derek. To Derek, I was just some quiet girl who got lucky. Derek was the golden boy of our department, tall, confident, Harvard MBA, and absolutely convinced that he was God's gift to the corporate world. From day one, he treated me like I was his personal assistant instead of his equal. He'd interrupt me in meetings, steal my ideas, and worst of all, he'd do it with this smug little smile that said, "What are you going to do about it?" Well, Derek, you're about to find out exactly what I was going to do about it. Let me paint you a picture of just how insufferable Derek really was. This guy would literally mansplain my own reports back to me. I'd spend weeks analyzing market trends, present my findings to the team, and Derek would raise his hand and say, "Well, what Sarah is trying to say is," and then repeat my exact words back to everyone like he was translating for them. The worst part, management ate it up. They nod along like Derek was some brilliant interpreter of my apparently incomprehensible thoughts. He'd take credit for my work so smoothly that sometimes I wondered if I was going crazy. I'd send him an email with a solution to a client problem, and the next day he'd present it in the meeting like it was his brainchild. When I'd try to speak up, he'd cut me off with, "Sarah, I think you're confused." This was my recommendation from yesterday's strategy session. The gaslighting was next level. But here's what Derek didn't know about me. I'm not just smart, I'm strategic. And I have a memory like a steel trap. While he was busy playing his little games, I was documenting everything. Every stolen idea, every interrupted meeting, every condescending comment. I had it all recorded, time-stamped, and categorized. You see, Derek made one crucial mistake. He assumed that because I didn't fight back immediately, I was weak. He confused my patience for passivity. Big mistake. The final straw came during the Henderson Industries pitch. This was huge, a potential $50 million client that could make or break our quarterly numbers. I'd been working on this proposal for 3 months, conducting market research, building financial models, and crafting what I knew was a winning strategy. The night before the presentation, I stayed until midnight perfecting every slide, every transition, every data point. I was ready to shine. The next morning, I walked into the conference room feeling confident for the first time in months. This was my moment to show everyone what I was really capable of. But when I got there, Derek was already setting up his laptop at the head of the table. My presentation was on his screen, my months of work, with his name on every slide. "Good morning, Sarah," he said with that infuriating smile. "Thanks for helping me put together some background research for this. Really appreciate the grunt work." I felt my blood turn to ice. The clients were already filing in, and there was nothing I could do without looking completely unprofessional. So I sat there and watched Derek present my work badly, I might add, while taking full credit for everything. He stumbled through the financial projections because he didn't actually understand the methodology. He couldn't answer basic questions about the market analysis because he hadn't done the research. But the clients didn't know that. All they saw was the smooth-talking Harvard boy in the expensive suit. We got the contract, and Derek got all the glory. That night, I went home and I made a decision. It was time for Derek to learn that actions have consequences. Move number 1 was all about building an ironclad case. See, Derek had gotten away with his behavior for so long because it was always his word against mine. And guess whose word carried more weight with management? But I realized I had something Derek didn't think about: a paper trail. I started by going through 3 years of emails, meeting notes, and project files. Every time Derek had taken credit for my work, there was evidence. The original email where I proposed the solution, the timestamp showing when I sent it versus when he came up with the idea, the document revision history showing who actually created what. It was all there, hiding in plain sight. But I didn't stop at just gathering existing evidence. I started creating new documentation for everything. Every conversation with Derek got followed up with an email. "Thanks for the chat, Derek," just to confirm what we discussed. Every meeting where he interrupted me got a follow-up note to the team to clarify the point I was making before we moved on. Every stolen idea got documented with timestamps and witnesses. I was building a fortress of evidence, and Derek had no idea what was coming. The beautiful thing about corporate environments is that everything leaves a digital footprint. Derek thought he was being clever, but he was actually creating evidence of his own misconduct with every email, every meeting, every stolen presentation. I also started keeping a detailed journal of every interaction, not just what happened, but who was present, what time it occurred, and how it impacted my work. I documented his pattern of behavior so thoroughly that even the best lawyer couldn't poke holes in it. But documentation alone wasn't enough. I needed allies, and I needed them to come to me naturally. So I started being more strategic about my relationships at work. I began having lunch with colleagues from other departments, really listening to their challenges and offering solutions. I volunteered for cross-functional projects that would put me in rooms where Derek wasn't the star. Slowly but surely, people started seeing the real me, not Derek's version of me. I discovered something interesting during this process. I wasn't Derek's only victim. Jennifer from marketing had been dealing with his condescension for 2 years. Mike and Heidi had watched Derek take credit for his system optimizations. Even some of the senior managers had started noticing that Derek's brilliant ideas often sounded suspiciously similar to things other people had mentioned in previous meetings. The more I listened, the more I realized that Derek had built his entire reputation on other people's work. He was like a parasite, feeding off everyone else's talent while contributing nothing of value himself. But here's the thing about parasites: once you expose them to light, they can't survive. I wasn't trying to turn people against Derek. I didn't have to. I just had to give them permission to see what was already there. I started asking innocent questions in meetings. "Derek, can you walk us through how you came up with this approach? Or what was your methodology for this analysis?" Watch someone try to explain work they didn't actually do. It's painful and obvious. People started noticing the gaps in Derek's knowledge, the way he deflected detailed questions, how he always seemed to have his best ideas right after talking to other team members. Move number 2 was about strategic positioning. I needed to make myself indispensable while simultaneously exposing Derek's incompetence. The perfect opportunity came when our department was tasked with implementing a new financial reporting system. This was a 6-month project that would touch every aspect of our operations, and whoever led it successfully would be in line for a major promotion. Derek predictably volunteered to spearhead the project. But here's what he didn't know. I had been researching this exact type of system implementation for months as part of my ongoing professional development. I knew the software inside and out. I understood the potential pitfalls, and I had connections with consultants who had done similar implementations. So when Derek confidently took on the project, I simply said, "Great, I'd love to support you however I can." He probably thought I was being sincere. I wasn't. I was positioning myself as the person with actual expertise while letting him hang himself with his own arrogance. The project started poorly from day one. Derek scheduled meetings without agendas, made promises to stakeholders without understanding the technical limitations, and consistently underestimated the time and resources required. Meanwhile, I was quietly solving problems behind the scenes, building relationships with the software vendor, and documenting every mistake Derek made. When stakeholders had questions Derek couldn't answer, they started coming to me directly. When technical issues arose that Derek couldn't resolve, I was the one who provided solutions. Slowly but surely, I became the person everyone trusted to actually get things done, while Derek became the person who showed up to meetings to take credit for my work. 3 months into the project, we hit a major crisis. The software implementation had uncovered serious inconsistencies in our historical data, and the external auditors were asking pointed questions. Derek panicked. In front of the entire senior leadership team, he threw me under the bus, claiming that I had been responsible for data validation and had obviously missed critical errors. It was a desperate move, and it backfired spectacularly. See, I had been preparing for this moment. I calmly pulled out my project documentation and walked the leadership team through the actual division of responsibilities. Derek had specifically insisted on handling all data validation himself because he didn't trust anyone else with such critical work. I had the emails to prove it. I had the meeting notes where he'd made these assignments. I had timestamps showing when I'd raised concerns about the data quality and how Derek had dismissed them. But here's the beautiful part: I didn't just defend myself. I presented a comprehensive solution to fix the data issues, complete with timeline, resource requirements, and risk mitigation strategies. While Derek was still stammering through excuses, I was already solving the problem. The room was silent for a moment, and then our VP, Patricia, spoke up. Sarah, this is exactly the kind of strategic thinking we need. I'd like you to take point on resolving this issue. Derek's face went white. In one meeting, he'd gone from project leader to liability, while I'd positioned myself as the competent problem solver. But I wasn't done with him yet. Not even close. Move number 3 was the coup de grace, and it required perfect timing. By this point, Derek was on shaky ground, but he still had enough political capital to potentially recover. I needed something that would end his career permanently, and I needed him to hand it to me himself. The opportunity came when Derek, desperate to rebuild his reputation, volunteered to present our department's annual performance review to the board of directors. This was a high-stakes presentation that would determine budget allocations and headcount for the following year. Derek saw it as his chance to get back in leadership's good graces. I saw it as his funeral. Here's what Derek didn't know. I had been informally advising Patricia on board presentation strategies for months. She'd started coming to me for insights after seeing how I handled the data crisis, and I'd been consistently providing valuable input on everything from market analysis to competitive positioning. So when Derek announced he'd be doing the board presentation, Patricia pulled me aside and asked if I thought he was the right choice. I didn't badmouth Derek. I didn't need to. I simply said, I think whoever presents needs to be prepared for very detailed questions about our methodology and future projections. The board doesn't like surface-level answers. Patricia nodded thoughtfully. She was already having doubts about Derek's capabilities, and I just confirmed her instincts. But I wasn't going to leave this to chance. I had one final card to play, and it was going to destroy Derek completely. You see, while I'd been documenting Derek's misconduct for 3 years, I'd also been building relationships with people throughout the company, including someone very special, Janet, the executive assistant to our CEO. Janet and I had bonded over our shared experience of being underestimated by men in suits. She'd been watching Derek's career with the same skeptical eye I had, and she'd noticed things that even I had missed, like how Derek would schedule strategy sessions with junior female employees that always seemed to happen over dinner, or how he'd make inappropriate comments about women's appearances during executive meetings when he thought no one important was listening. Janet had been keeping her own documentation, and when I finally shared my concerns about Derek's pattern of stealing credit and undermining colleagues, she realized we were seeing the same person from different angles. Together, we hatched the perfect plan. Janet had access to Derek's calendar, his email patterns, and most importantly, she knew exactly what topics the board would focus on during the annual review. She casually mentioned to Derek that the board was particularly interested in innovative approaches to client retention and emerging market opportunities, two areas where I had done extensive research that Derek had previously claimed as his own work. Derek took the bait completely. He started reaching out to me for collaboration on his board presentation, which was really just his way of trying to get me to do the work for him again. But this time, I was ready for him. I gave him exactly what he asked for, a presentation that looked impressive on the surface but would fall apart under scrutiny. The financial projections were based on outdated market data. The client retention strategies ignored recent changes in industry regulations. The emerging market analysis relied on assumptions that any board member with basic business knowledge would immediately question. It was like handing a loaded gun to someone who didn't know it was pointed at their own foot. But the real masterpiece was in the appendix. I included detailed methodology notes that Derek would never read, but that would expose every piece of work he'd stolen from me over the past 3 years. The day of the board presentation arrived, and Derek was confident. He'd practiced his talking points, he looked sharp in his expensive suit, and he had what he thought was a brilliant presentation courtesy of his collaboration with me. I made sure to arrive early and take a seat where I could see both Derek and the board members' faces. This was going to be better than any movie. Derek started strong, delivering his opening remarks with his usual polished confidence. The board seemed engaged, nodding along as he outlined our department's achievements for the year. But then came the first question. Board member Margaret Chen, a former McKinsey partner with a reputation for cutting through nonsense, asked about the methodology behind our client retention projections. Derek's smile faltered slightly, but he launched into a surface-level explanation that sounded good but said nothing. Margaret wasn't satisfied. Can you walk us through the specific data sources you used and how you accounted for the regulatory changes in Q3? Derek's face went blank. He fumbled through a non-answer, claiming the details were proprietary and complex. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Then CEO Robert Kim joined the attack. Derek, these emerging market projections show 40% growth potential, but they don't seem to account for the currency fluctuations we discussed in last month's risk assessment meeting. How do you reconcile that? Another fumble, another non-answer. By the time board member David Rodriguez asked about the correlation between our client retention strategies and the new compliance requirements, Derek was visibly sweating. He kept looking at his notes like they might suddenly provide answers they'd never contained. The massacre continued for 20 more minutes. Every question exposed another gap in Derek's knowledge, another stolen piece of analysis he couldn't defend. The boardroom was a battlefield, and Derek was out of ammunition. Finally, Margaret Chen delivered the killing blow. Derek, I have to say, this analysis is remarkably similar to some work I saw Sarah present at the Regional Finance Conference last year. The emerging market framework is nearly identical. Can you explain the relationship between your work and hers? The room went dead silent. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The moment Derek had created for himself through 3 years of theft and arrogance. Derek's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He looked at me desperately, probably hoping I'd jump in to save him like I had so many times before. But I just sat there with a neutral expression, waiting to see how he'd explain stealing my intellectual property to a room full of executives. Well, Derek stammered, Sarah and I worked very closely together on this analysis. It was really a team effort, and I wanted to make sure her contributions were recognized. It was too little too late, and everyone in the room knew it. CEO Kim leaned forward. Derek, if this was collaborative work, why isn't Sarah's name anywhere on the presentation materials? And why didn't you mention her contributions in your opening remarks? The trap had been sprung perfectly. Derek had been caught red-handed taking credit for work that wasn't his, in front of the most important people in the company during the most critical presentation of the year. But I still had one more surprise for him. Margaret Chen continued, Actually, I'd like to hear from Sarah directly. Sarah, can you walk us through your methodology for the emerging market analysis? This was my moment. I stood up calmly and delivered a flawless 15-minute presentation about work that Derek had claimed as his own but clearly didn't understand. I explained the data sources, the analytical framework, the risk assessments, and the regulatory considerations. I answered every question with precision and confidence, because it was my work, my research, my expertise. When I finished, the room was silent except for the sound of Derek's career imploding. Robert Kim spoke first. Sarah, that was exceptional work. The depth of analysis and strategic thinking is exactly what we need at the senior level. Then he turned to Derek with ice in his voice. Derek, I think we need to have a conversation about attribution and collaborative work practices. This presentation raises some serious questions about project ownership and intellectual honesty. Derek tried to salvage the situation. I think there might be some confusion about roles and responsibilities. Sarah did excellent support work, but the strategic vision and final analysis were mine. It was pathetic watching him dig his own grave deeper. Patricia, who had been silent throughout the disaster, finally spoke up. Derek, I have Sarah's original research files from 8 months ago. Her methodology, her data sources, her conclusions, they're all documented with timestamps. Would you like me to walk through the timeline of when this work was actually completed? Derek's face went ashen. He realized that his years of theft had finally caught up with him, and there was no talking his way out of it. The board meeting ended with Robert Kim asking Derek to take some time to reflect on professional standards and appropriate collaboration practices. Corporate speak for "you're in deep trouble." As people filed out of the room, several board members stopped to compliment my analysis and strategic thinking. Margaret Chen handed me her business card and said, Sarah, have you ever considered consulting work? I know several firms that would be very interested in your expertise. Derek slunk out without making eye contact with anyone. He knew what I knew. His career at this company was over. But I wasn't finished with him yet. The real consequences were just beginning. Within 48 hours of the board presentation disaster, HR called Derek in for a formal meeting. Apparently, several people had come forward with concerns about his work practices and professional conduct. I wasn't surprised once people realize it's safe to speak up. The floodgates tend to open. Jennifer from marketing finally reported how Derek had taken credit for her customer segmentation strategy. Mike from ID documented how Derek had presented his system optimization recommendations as his own insights. 3 junior analysts came forward with stories about Derek asking them to do research for his personal projects that later became his presentations to senior management. Even some of Derek's supposed allies started distancing themselves. His lunch buddy from accounting suddenly remembered how Derek had a habit of borrowing ideas from team meetings and presenting them as his own brainstorms. It was like watching dominoes fall. But the most damaging revelation came from Janet, the CEO's executive assistant. She presented HR with a comprehensive timeline of Derek's misconduct, complete with email evidence, meeting notes, and witness statements. Janet had been building this case for months, documenting not just the intellectual property theft, but also the inappropriate comments, the attempts to undermine female colleagues, and the pattern of taking credit for other people's work. The HR investigation was swift and thorough. They brought in an external consultant to review 3 years of Derek's project work, comparing his claimed contributions with the actual documentation trail. What they found was devastating. Derek had built his entire career on other people's work. Nearly every major success he'd claimed could be traced back to someone else's original research, analysis, or strategic thinking. The evidence was so overwhelming that even Derek's most loyal supporters couldn't defend him. His pattern of behavior was systematic, deliberate, and undeniable. 2 weeks after the board presentation, Derek was called into another meeting with HR, Patricia, and Robert Kim. I wasn't in the room, but Janet filled me in on the details later. They presented Derek with a thick folder containing all the evidence of his misconduct. 3 years of stolen work, documented with precision that would make a forensic accountant proud. The meeting lasted less than 20 minutes. Derek was given two choices: resign immediately with a basic severance package and a neutral reference, or be terminated for cause with no severance and a detailed explanation of his misconduct in his personnel file. He chose to resign, probably hoping to salvage some dignity and job prospects. But word travels fast in our industry, and Derek's reputation was already damaged beyond repair. While Derek was cleaning out his office, I was being called into a very different kind of meeting. Patricia and Robert Kim wanted to discuss my future with the company. They offered me Derek's position as senior financial analyst, along with a 40% salary increase and a direct reporting line to the VP level. They also asked me to lead the completion of the financial reporting system implementation, the project Derek had botched so spectacularly. But the real victory wasn't the promotion or the money. It was the vindication. For 3 years, Derek had made me doubt my own worth, question my contributions, and feel like I was invisible in my own workplace. Now everyone could see what I had always known. I was the one with the real talent, the genuine expertise, and the strategic thinking that drove results. The junior analysts who had watched Derek steal my work started coming to me for mentorship. Colleagues from other departments began reaching out for collaboration on their projects. Senior leadership included me in strategic planning sessions that Derek had never been invited to. Despite his higher title and louder voice, Derek's career never recovered from the scandal. Within a month of leaving our company, word had spread through our professional network about his misconduct. The finance community is smaller than you might think, and reputation matters everything. Several companies that had been courting Derek suddenly went silent when they heard about the plagiarism allegations. His LinkedIn profile, once full of congratulatory messages and networking invitations, became a ghost town. Former colleagues stopped endorsing his skills, and new connection requests went unanswered. He eventually took a position at a much smaller firm for significantly less money and prestige. Even there, his reputation preceded him. Colleagues were suspicious of his ideas, questioned his contributions, and watched him carefully for signs of the behavior that had destroyed his previous career. Derek had learned the hard way that trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to rebuild. But the most satisfying part of Derek's downfall wasn't professional, it was personal. Remember how he used to strut around the office like he owned the place? How he'd interrupt people in meetings and talk over anyone who dared to challenge his authority? All of that confidence evaporated when his incompetence was exposed so publicly. I ran into Derek about 6 months after he'd left the company. He was at a networking event, standing alone in a corner while everyone else mingled and made connections. When he saw me, he actually tried to approach and make small talk. The desperation in his eyes was obvious. He wanted to know if I might be willing to provide a reference, or perhaps recommend him for opportunities at my company. I was polite but firm. "I don't think that would be appropriate, Derek. I'm sure you understand." He did understand. For the first time in his career, Derek was experiencing what it felt like to be dismissed, underestimated, and ignored. It was poetic justice. Looking back on this 3-year saga, I learned some valuable lessons about workplace dynamics, personal power, and the importance of documentation. First, never underestimate the quiet person in the room. Derek made the classic mistake of confusing silence with weakness, patience with passivity. He assumed that because I didn't fight back immediately, I wasn't capable of fighting back at all. But sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one who takes time to plan their moves carefully. Second, document everything. In corporate environments, your word is only as good as your evidence. Derek got away with his behavior for years because it was always his word against his victims, and he had the advantage of confidence and political connections. But once I started building a comprehensive paper trail, his denials became irrelevant. The evidence spoke for itself. Third, build genuine relationships with your colleagues. I didn't set out to turn people against Derek. I simply focused on being helpful, competent, and trustworthy in my interactions with others. When the time came to speak up about Derek's misconduct, people were willing to listen because they had experienced my character firsthand. Your reputation is built through consistent actions over time, not through smooth talking or political maneuvering. Fourth, competence always wins in the long run. Derek could steal my ideas and take credit for my work, but he couldn't steal my knowledge, my skills, or my ability to perform under pressure. When the board asked detailed questions about the analysis he'd claimed as his own, his lack of genuine expertise was immediately obvious. You can fake confidence, but you can't fake competence forever. Finally, timing is everything. I could have exposed Derek's misconduct at any point during those 3 years, but I waited for the perfect moment when the stakes were highest and the audience was most important. The board presentation wasn't just Derek's opportunity to shine, it was his opportunity to fail spectacularly in front of people who mattered. The most surprising thing about this whole experience was how it changed me as a person and as a professional. Before Derek, I was competent but relatively passive. I did good work, but I didn't advocate for myself or demand recognition. I let other people set the terms of engagement, and I accepted being undervalued as just part of the corporate experience. But watching Derek steal my work and claim my successes taught me that competence without advocacy is just martyrdom. You can be the smartest person in the room, but if you don't speak up for yourself, someone else will take credit for your intelligence. You can solve every problem and generate every good idea, but if you don't claim ownership of your contributions, you'll watch someone else get promoted while you stay invisible. The Derek experience taught me to document my contributions, speak up in meetings, and make sure my name was attached to my work. I learned to send follow-up emails after important conversations, to present my own ideas instead of letting others interpret them, and to push back when someone tried to take credit for my efforts. But I also learned that there's a difference between self-advocacy and Derek's toxic behavior. Derek tore others down to build himself up. He lied about his contributions and stole other people's work because he didn't have the skills to succeed on his own merits. My approach was different. I focused on making my actual contributions visible and undeniable. I didn't need to lie or steal because my work spoke for itself once people could see it clearly. The promotion I received after Derek's departure was just the beginning. Over the next 2 years, I was promoted twice more, eventually reaching the VP level that Derek had always coveted but never achieved. The difference was that my promotions were based on genuine accomplishments, documented results, and the respect of colleagues who had seen me perform under pressure. Derek's downfall had ripple effects throughout our organization that I hadn't anticipated. His exposure led to a broader conversation about workplace culture, attribution practices, and how to create environments where everyone's contributions are recognized and valued. HR implemented new policies requiring explicit attribution for collaborative work. Team meetings started including agenda items for recognizing individual contributions to group projects. Performance reviews began incorporating feedback from peers and subordinates, not just supervisors, a change that would have exposed Derek's behavior much earlier. The company also started offering training on unconscious bias, particularly around how ideas from women and minorities are often dismissed or attributed to others. Several senior managers admitted that they had unknowingly participated in Derek's pattern of taking credit for other people's work. By failing to ask critical questions about project ownership and contribution, but the most significant change was cultural. Derek's spectacular failure became a cautionary tale that spread throughout the organization. People started paying closer attention to who actually generated ideas versus who presented them. Colleagues began speaking up when they saw someone taking inappropriate credit for another person's work. The Derek incident created awareness that made it much harder for future Dereks to operate with impunity. I also noticed changes in how people interacted with me. Colleagues who had previously dismissed my contributions or talked over me in meetings suddenly became much more respectful, not because they feared me, But because Derek's downfall had demonstrated that quiet competence could be more dangerous than loud incompetence, people realized that underestimating the wrong person could have serious consequences for their own careers. Junior employees started coming to me for advice on how to document their contributions and advocate for themselves. I became an informal mentor for people who felt their work was being overlooked or stolen, helping them build the same kind of comprehensive documentation that had been so effective in Derek's case. This story isn't just about one toxic coworker getting his comeuppance. It's about systemic issues in workplace culture that allow people like Derek to thrive. Derek succeeded for years because he operated in an environment that rewarded confidence over competence, volume over value, and political maneuvering over genuine contribution. He understood that perception often matters more than reality in corporate settings, and he exploited that understanding ruthlessly. But Derek's approach was ultimately unsustainable because it was built on a foundation of lies. You can only steal so many ideas, take credit for so many projects, and fool so many people before the truth catches up with you. And when it does catch up, the fall is usually swift and devastating. The Derek experience taught me that toxic behavior in the workplace isn't just an individual problem. It's an organizational problem that requires systematic solutions. Companies that allow people like Derek to succeed are companies that don't have proper systems for tracking contributions, recognizing talent, or holding people accountable for their claims. They're companies where politics matter more than performance, and where the loudest voice wins regardless of the quality of ideas. But it also taught me that individuals have more power than they realize to change these dynamics. By documenting my contributions, building genuine relationships, and strategically positioning myself for success, I was able to expose Derek's fraud and claim the recognition I deserved. The key was patience, preparation, and perfect execution. I also learned that justice in the workplace isn't automatic, it requires action. Derek's behavior was obvious to anyone who paid attention, but most people chose to ignore it because confronting him seemed too difficult or risky. It took someone willing to build a comprehensive case and present it at the right moment to finally hold him accountable. Change doesn't happen by itself. It requires people who are willing to fight for what's right, even when that fight takes years to win. After Derek's departure, the entire dynamic of our department shifted in ways I hadn't anticipated. Without his toxic presence constantly undermining collaboration, people started actually working together instead of competing for credit. The junior analysts who had been terrified of having their ideas stolen began speaking up in meetings, contributing insights that had been suppressed for years. Jennifer from marketing started collaborating with our team on client strategies, something she'd avoided when Derek was around because he always found ways to claim her contributions as his own. Mike from IT became a regular partner on our system optimization projects, finally comfortable sharing his innovative approaches without fear of intellectual theft. The atmosphere in meetings transformed from tense competition to genuine collaboration. People started building on each other's ideas instead of hoarding them, and productivity increased dramatically. It was like watching a garden bloom after removing a poisonous weed that had been stunting everyone's growth. But the most significant change was in how leadership approached project management and attribution. Patricia implemented a new system where every project required explicit documentation of individual contributions, with regular check-ins to ensure proper credit was given. The days of vague team efforts that allowed people like Derek to steal credit were over. As word spread about how I'd handled the Derek situation, I found myself in an unexpected role as a mentor to colleagues dealing with similar workplace bullies. Sarah from the accounting department reached out after her manager started taking credit for her process improvements. I walked her through the documentation strategies I'd used, showing her how to create an evidence trail that would be impossible to dispute. Marcus, a junior analyst in our sister company, contacted me about a senior colleague who was systematically stealing his research. I helped him understand the importance of time-stamped communications, and how to build relationships with allies who could witness his contributions. 3 women from different departments formed an informal support group, sharing strategies for dealing with credit theft and professional undermining. We called ourselves the Documentation Squad, and we met monthly to discuss best practices for protecting our work and advancing our careers. The network grew organically as people shared their success stories and learned from each other's experiences. What started as revenge against one toxic colleague had evolved into a movement for workplace justice and professional empowerment. I realized that Derek's behavior wasn't unique. It was symptomatic of broader cultural issues that many organizations struggle with. The skills I developed in building my case against Derek became templates that others could adapt to their own situations. 6 months after Derek's departure, I was invited to speak at the Regional Finance Conference about strategic documentation and professional development, the same conference where Derek had once presented my stolen research as his own work. The irony wasn't lost on me as I stood at the podium, presenting a session called Building Unshakable Professional Credibility. The audience was packed with finance professionals who had heard rumors about Derek's downfall and wanted to understand how to protect themselves from similar situations. I shared my strategies for documentation, relationship building, and strategic career positioning without mentioning Derek by name. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of people approached me afterward with their own stories of workplace theft and professional undermining. Margaret Chen, the board member who had helped expose Derek's incompetence, introduced me to several executive recruiters who specialized in placing senior finance professionals. Within weeks, I was fielding calls from Fortune 500 companies interested in my strategic thinking and proven track record of results. The same expertise that Derek had tried to steal and claim as his own was now opening doors I'd never imagined possible. Industry publications started reaching out for interviews about workplace collaboration and professional integrity. My LinkedIn profile exploded with connection requests from senior executives who wanted to network with someone who had demonstrated both competence and character under pressure. About a year after his departure, Derek made a desperate attempt to rehabilitate his reputation and return to our industry's elite circles. He started a consulting firm with a grandiose name, Strategic Excellence Solutions, positioning himself as an expert in financial analysis and market strategy. His website was full of buzzwords and generic business speak, but notably absent were any specific case studies or verifiable results. Derek began reaching out to former clients and colleagues, trying to leverage old relationships to generate business for his new venture. But the finance community has a long memory, and word of his misconduct had spread far beyond our company. Potential clients who did their due diligence quickly discovered the circumstances of his departure and the plagiarism allegations. His few early consulting engagements ended badly when clients realized his analysis was superficial, and his strategic recommendations were recycled from other sources. Derek's attempt to rebrand himself as an independent expert only highlighted his fundamental problem. He had never developed genuine expertise, only the ability to steal and repackage other people's work. Without access to a team of talented colleagues to exploit, his limitations became impossible to hide. The consulting firm folded within 8 months, leaving Derek with debt and an even more damaged reputation. His LinkedIn profile became increasingly desperate, with posts about reinventing yourself and learning from setbacks that fooled no one in our professional network. The Derek incident had created a ripple effect that extended far beyond our company and into the broader industry culture. HR directors at other firms started implementing similar documentation requirements and attribution policies after hearing about our case. Professional associations began offering workshops on intellectual property protection and collaborative work ethics. The Regional Finance Association even created a new code of conduct, specifically addressing credit attribution and professional integrity. Derek's downfall had become a cautionary tale that was reshaping how people thought about workplace behavior and professional responsibility. Young professionals entering the field were being warned about the career-ending consequences of taking credit for others' work. Senior executives were paying closer attention to the dynamics within their teams and the accuracy of attribution in presentations and reports. The culture of fake it till you make it that had allowed Derek to thrive was being replaced by a new emphasis on demonstrable competence and verified contributions. Companies started implementing peer review processes for major presentations and strategic documents. The era of allowing smooth-talking executives to claim credit without scrutiny was coming to an end. Derek had inadvertently become the poster child for everything wrong with toxic workplace culture, and his spectacular failure was driving positive change across the industry. The 3-year battle with Derek had fundamentally changed who I was as a person and as a professional. I had entered the conflict as someone who preferred to avoid confrontation and let my work speak for itself. But I emerged as someone who understood the critical importance of strategic thinking, careful documentation, and tactical patience. The experience taught me that competence alone isn't enough in competitive environments. You need to be able to protect and promote your contributions. I learned to see workplace dynamics as a complex chess game where every move has consequences and timing is everything. The quiet, accommodating person who had allowed Derek to steal her work for years was gone, replaced by someone who commanded respect through demonstrated capability and strategic awareness. But I was careful not to become the thing I had fought against. Unlike Derek, who built his reputation by tearing others down, I focused on lifting others up while protecting my own interests. The mentorship work I was doing with junior colleagues wasn't just altruistic. It was building a network of allies who understood the value of genuine collaboration over toxic competition. I had learned to be strategic without being manipulative, assertive without being aggressive, and protective without being paranoid. The transformation had made me a more effective leader and a more valuable contributor to any organization. 3 years after his departure from our company, Derek's career never recovered from the reputational damage. His attempts to find employment at firms comparable to our company were repeatedly unsuccessful. Background checks and reference calls consistently revealed the circumstances of his departure and the plagiarism allegations. The positions he could obtain were increasingly junior and poorly compensated, a stark contrast to the executive track he had once seemed destined for. His professional network, once extensive and valuable, had largely abandoned him as word of his misconduct spread. Former colleagues who had once sought his advice and collaboration now avoided association with him. The industry conferences where he had once been a sought-after speaker no longer extended invitations. Derek's fall from grace was complete and seemingly permanent. He had learned too late that reputation, once destroyed, is nearly impossible to rebuild in professional circles where trust and integrity are paramount. The shortcuts he had taken to build his career, stealing ideas, taking false credit, undermining colleagues, had ultimately led to his professional destruction. His case had become a textbook example of how toxic behavior, even when initially successful, inevitably leads to long-term failure. The very traits that had made him successful in the short term, arrogance, dishonesty, and exploitation of others, had made his downfall inevitable. As I continued to advance in my career, I made a conscious decision to build my legacy on principles that were the opposite of Derek's approach. Instead of stealing credit, I made sure to give credit generously to team members who contributed to successful projects, rather than undermining colleagues. I actively mentored and supported other professionals, especially women and minorities who faced similar challenges to what I had experienced. My approach to leadership emphasized transparency, collaboration, and the development of others rather than self-promotion at any cost. The teams I led became known for their innovation, their collaborative culture, and their track record of developing talent. Young professionals sought assignments to my projects, because they knew their contributions would be recognized and their careers would be advanced. This approach proved far more sustainable and satisfying than Derek's toxic methods had ever been. My reputation in the industry was built on a foundation of genuine expertise, verified results, and ethical behavior that could withstand any scrutiny. The relationships I built were based on mutual respect and shared success rather than exploitation and fear. When opportunities arose for speaking engagements, consulting work, or executive positions, I was recommended by colleagues who had positive experiences working with me. The network I had built was strong because it was based on trust and reciprocal value rather than manipulation and self-interest. My success was sustainable because it was earned through legitimate means and built on a foundation of actual competence. 2 years after Derek's departure, we encountered each other one final time at an industry networking event. I was there as a keynote speaker, presenting on strategic leadership and organizational culture to an audience of senior executives. Derek was there as a desperate job seeker, working the room with business cards and increasingly forced enthusiasm. When he saw me, his face cycled through a range of emotions: surprise, embarrassment, anger, and finally, a calculated attempt at charm. He approached me after my presentation with what he probably thought was a disarming smile. "Sarah, great to see you," he said, extending his hand as if we were old friends who had simply lost touch. "Congratulations on all your success. I always knew you had potential." The audacity was breathtaking. Derek was trying to rewrite history, positioning himself as someone who had recognized and supported my talent, rather than someone who had systematically tried to undermine it. I looked at him calmly and said, "Thank you, Derek. I've learned a lot about the importance of taking credit for your own work and giving credit where it's due." The comment landed like a precision strike, and Derek's manufactured smile faltered for just a moment. He knew that I knew exactly what he was trying to do, and that his attempt to gaslight me had failed completely. The conversation ended awkwardly, with Derek mumbling something about keeping in touch before retreating to another part of the room. It was a fitting final encounter. Derek still trying to manipulate the narrative, and me calmly but firmly refusing to let him rewrite history.